Keyword intro reveal. Antikythera. On Easter Monday in the spring of 1900, a sponge diver named Elias Stadiatis stepped over the side of a small wooden boat off the southern cliffs of the Greek island of Antikythera. He was wearing a canvas suit, a copper helmet, and lead-weighted boots. The line that fed him air ran up to a hand pump on the deck above. He was 45 meters down, in cold water, on a rocky ledge that his crew had not intended to dive. They had been sheltering from a storm. The wind had pushed them off course on the way back from the African coast. The captain, Dimitrios Kontos, had decided to wait it out beside the cliffs of the small island that sits between Crete and the Peloponnese. While they waited, the men went down to look at the seabed, because that is what sponge divers did when there was time and good water beneath them. Stadiatis surfaced after only a few minutes. He was, by the later accounts of his crewmates, badly shaken. He returned holding a bronze arm. What Stadiatis had seen in the dim green light at the foot of the ledge was a Roman-era shipwreck. The horses were bronze statues. The dead bodies were marble figures, half buried in the silt, with their limbs broken off and scattered across the slope. The ship had gone down sometime in the 1st century before the Common Era, carrying a cargo of Greek art bound, almost certainly, for a wealthy buyer in Italy. Over the following 2 years, divers brought up amphorae, coins, jewelry, statuary, and fragments of bronze too corroded to identify. Most of it was beautiful. Some of it was famous. One piece in particular looked at first like nothing at all. It was a lump of green-grey metal about the size of a thick book, encrusted in marine deposit. Inside it, faintly visible, was the suggestion of geared wheels. A museum worker in Athens, sorting the cargo in the summer of 1902, noticed that the lump had cracked open along an old fault line. Inside, pressed against the corroded bronze, was the impression of a small-toothed wheel. Beside it, in raised letters almost too faint to read, was a single Greek word. The word was a fragment of an astronomical term. It described the rising of a particular star. The lump that the diver had thought was a coin was, in fact, the surviving fragment of the oldest known geared computer in the world. Lower third. Antikythera, 1800. The island of Antikythera is small. It is roughly 20 square kilometers of limestone, rising abruptly from the sea between the western tip of Crete and the southern shore of the Peloponnese. In 1900, it had a population of perhaps 150 people, most of them shepherds, and no harbor deep enough for a steamer. The sponge divers who found the wreck were not from Antikythera. They were from the island of Symi in the Dodecanese, on the other side of the Aegean. They had been working the Libyan coast that winter and were sailing home with their season's catch when the storm caught them west of Crete. Sponge diving, at the turn of the 20th century, was the most dangerous trade in the Greek islands. The men used the new hard hat suits, fed by surface-pumped air, and they routinely worked at depths that exceeded what their physiology could safely tolerate. The condition that we now call decompression sickness was known on Symi as the diver's paralysis. It killed roughly 1 diver in 12 every season on the Aegean fleets. The Antikythera wreck lay at 45 meters. That was, by the standards of the time, deep but workable. The site was a steep underwater slope, beginning at about 40 meters and falling away to over 55, with the bulk of the cargo concentrated on a ledge near the upper edge. When Kontos brought his men back to the surface that first day, with the bronze arm in the boat, he did not immediately announce the discovery. He sailed instead to Athens, presented the arm to the authorities, and asked for permission to salvage the wreck on a contract basis. The Greek government, in the person of the Minister of Education, agreed. The salvage began in November of 1901, supervised by the Royal Hellenic Navy, and continued for 9 months. It was the first major underwater archaeological recovery operation ever conducted. There was no precedent for what the divers were being asked to do, and there were no procedures for how the recovered objects should be handled. The men brought up everything they could reach. They lifted bronze statues, marble torsos, ceramic amphorae, glass vessels, and bronze fittings of every description. They worked in shifts of 10 minutes at depth, ascending without staged decompression, which was not yet understood. One diver died during the salvage. 2 were permanently paralyzed. The cargo was loaded onto a Navy steamer and transferred to Piraeus. From there, it was carted up to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. It was laid out on long wooden tables in the basement and left, for the most part, to dry. It is at this point, in the summer of 1902, that the corroded lump that no one had paid attention to began to crack along its hidden seam. The man who first saw what was inside the lump was a former Greek minister of education, an archaeologist named Spiridon Stais. He was visiting the museum on the 17th of May 1902 in his capacity as a private scholar. He noticed the cracked fragment lying on a table, picked it up, and turned it toward the light. The interior surface, where the corrosion had given way, showed the unmistakable impression of a toothed bronze wheel. Stais immediately understood that this was something unusual. Toothed gearwork, in the form that the fragment displayed, was not a feature of any Greek or Roman object that anyone in the museum had ever catalogued. Mechanical clocks of any kind would not appear in Europe for another 14 centuries. He wrote a short paper. He read it before the Athens Archaeological Society. He suggested, with great care, that the object might be the remains of an ancient astronomical instrument, perhaps a navigational device, perhaps a planetarium of some kind. He noted the inscriptions that were visible on the surface and asked that the fragment be cleaned and studied further. The paper was politely received. It was not, however, accepted. The prevailing opinion among Stais' colleagues was that the gearwork must belong to a later period. The object, in their view, had somehow fallen into the wreck from a passing vessel of more recent date. It could not, in any case, be as old as the ship that contained it. The fragment was placed in a wooden display case in a side room of the museum and labeled simply "Bronze, Function Unknown." It would remain there, more or less undisturbed, for the next half-century. Lower third, Athens, 918. 05. Spiridon Stais' first paper was published in the Proceedings of the Athens Archaeological Society in 1903. It was a short notice, perhaps 4 pages, with a single-line drawing of the visible gear teeth on the larger of the surviving fragments. It attracted the attention of one other scholar, a Greek admiral and amateur historian of science named Pericles Rhodiades. Rhodiades was, by training, a naval officer. He had taught navigation at the Hellenic Naval Academy, and he had a working knowledge of nautical instruments: the astrolabe, the quadrant, the mariner's compass. He believed, on the basis of the visible inscriptions, that the Antikythera fragment was a kind of geared astrolabe. He published his interpretation in 1910, in a small monograph that argued the device had been used to measure the altitude of stars. It was, in his view, a navigational tool, possibly the property of a Greek pilot who had perished with the ship. Rhodiades was wrong about almost everything. He was wrong about the function, he was wrong about the user, and he was wrong about the mechanism. But he was right decisively about one thing. The fragment was Greek. It belonged to the wreck. It dated to the 1st or 2nd century before the Common Era. And the mechanical sophistication that it displayed was real and original. It was not the property of any later civilization that had somehow contaminated the site. The precise tooth count of the visible wheels, the careful spacing, the evidence of an internal drivetrain, all of it belonged to the wreck. In 1907, the fragments were photographed for the first time. The photographs were poor by modern standards. The bronze had been heavily oxidized by 2,000 years of seawater. Most of the internal structure was concealed beneath a layer of corrosion product. The conservation methods of the period could not safely remove that layer. Even so, the photographs revealed enough to suggest that there were in fact several gears, not one. The largest visible wheel had a clearly delineated set of teeth, and the spacing of those teeth was geometrically regular to a degree that no ornamental object would require. Whatever the device was, it had been designed to compute. A small body of scholarly literature accumulated through the 1910s and 20s. The German philologist Albert Rehm worked from Stice's photographs and from a partial transcription of the visible Greek inscriptions. He suggested that the device might be a planetarium of the kind described by the Roman orator Cicero. Cicero, in the 1st century before the Common Era, had written admiringly of 2 such machines. They had been built by Archimedes of Syracuse and brought to Rome by the general Marcellus. Cicero had described these instruments in 2 of his philosophical dialogues. They were, by his account, bronze spheres or panels driven by a single mechanical mechanism. They displayed the motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 known planets. The accuracy was such that an eclipse of the moon could be predicted simply by turning a handle. Cicero had assumed that his readers would find the existence of such devices astonishing but credible. They were not, in the rhetoric of his time, magical. They were craftsmanship. They were what a Greek workshop, given enough patience and bronze, could be expected to produce. For nearly 2,000 years, no archaeological evidence of any such device had ever been found. And then, for a while, the workshop is silent. Rehm's hypothesis, set out in lecture notes that he never fully published, was rejected by most of his colleagues. The standard view, established by the 1930s, was that the Antikythera fragment was an interesting curiosity, probably astronomical, possibly didactic, almost certainly less elaborate than Rehm had suggested. The Second World War interrupted the conversation entirely. The Athens Museum was evacuated. The fragments were packed into wooden crates and stored, with the rest of the collection, in a series of secure rooms in the basement of the Greek National Bank. When the war ended, the crates were returned to their cases. The fragments were photographed again, more carefully this time, and a brief description was added to the museum catalogue. There were now 3 principal pieces, labelled A, B, and C, and 4 smaller ones. Together they weighed perhaps 3 kilograms. In 1951, a 30-year-old English physicist who had just taken a research post at the University of Cambridge happened to read an article about the fragments in a popular science magazine. His name was Derek de Solla Price, lower third, Cambridge. 1851, Derek John de Solla Price was born in London in 1922, the son of a tailor. He took his first degree in physics, served briefly in the war, and completed a doctorate on the spectroscopy of hot gases. Then, in a turn that he later described as accidental, he became a historian of science. He moved to Cambridge in 1946 to work on the cataloguing of the medieval scientific manuscripts held by the university library. The work suited him. He had the temperament of a careful reader, and he had, unusually for a physicist of his generation, a working knowledge of Latin and Greek. The article that he read in 1951 was a short feature in a British popular magazine, illustrated with a single black and white photograph of the Antikythera fragments. The caption described them, conventionally, as the remains of an ancient astrolabe. Price did not believe the caption. He had read Cicero. He had read the relevant passages in the writings of the Roman architect Vitruvius. These were the Hellenistic engineers who had documented in the 3rd and 2nd centuries before the Common Era a tradition of complex mechanical devices. The tradition included water organs, geared odometers and automated theatres. The historical record, in other words, suggested that a Greek workshop in the 2nd century before the Common Era was entirely capable of producing geared instruments of considerable sophistication. The Antikythera fragments on Price's reading did not need to be a curiosity. They could be the surviving physical evidence of a tradition that the textual record had been pointing toward for 2,000 years. He wrote to the Athens Museum in the autumn of 1951. He asked for access to the fragments, for permission to make casts, and for the museum's cooperation in attempting a fuller mechanical reading of the device. The reply came back in the spring of 1952. The museum was willing. The fragments could be examined. The casts could be made. The work could begin. It would take Price the next 22 years. He traveled to Athens for the first time in the summer of 1958 with a young Greek physicist named Charalambos Karakalos, who held a position at the Greek Atomic Energy Commission. Karakalos brought with him a small portable X-ray unit. The plan was simple. They would attempt to photograph the interior of the fragments by passing X-rays through them and recording the gear structures on radiographic film. The first attempts were not successful. The bronze, at the thicknesses involved, absorbed too much of the beam. The images were blurred and indistinct. The two men returned to the museum repeatedly through the late 1950s and early 1960s. They refined their technique, increased the beam intensity, and lengthened the exposure times. By 1963, they had produced a series of plates that showed for the first time the structures buried inside fragment A. What the plates showed was startling. The largest fragment, which had previously been thought to contain perhaps 8 or 10 gears, in fact contained at least 27. They were arranged in a complex internal architecture of layered wheels, mounted on parallel axles, with tooth counts that ranged from 16 up to over 225. The teeth were small, between 1 and 2 millimeters in length, and they had been cut by hand with what must have been a very fine triangular file. The wheels were nested inside one another in 2 principal layers, with a central drive shaft that emerged through a square hole in the front face of the device. Price reconstructed, on the basis of the gear ratios, the function of the drivetrain. The shaft, when turned, advanced one wheel by a precise fraction of a revolution. That wheel, in turn, advanced another, and so on. He published his initial findings in a short paper in the journal Scientific American in 1959. The paper attracted attention, but not, in the historical community, immediate acceptance. The view that the device represented a unique high point of Hellenistic engineering remained controversial. Most classical scholars continued to regard the Antikythera mechanism as an anomaly, possibly even a forgery, certainly not a representative artifact of its period. Price worked on. He moved to Yale University in 1960, taking up the chair in the history of science that the philosopher George Sarton had once occupied. He continued to visit Athens. He continued to refine his reconstruction. His definitive paper appeared in 1974 in the Transactions of the American Philosophical Society under the title Gears from the Greeks. It ran to 70 pages. It contained the first complete reconstruction of the mechanism's internal architecture. It contained the first published tooth counts for all the visible wheels and the first plausible identification of the principal astronomical functions. And it contained the first explicit proposal that the device was, in functional terms, an analog computer. was the work of a lifetime. Price died of a heart attack in the autumn of 1983. He was 60 years old. He had spent more than half of his professional life on the fragments. His reconstruction was not, in every detail, correct. He had missed, in particular, the existence of a second and more elaborate set of gears on the back of the device. The structure of those gears had not been visible on the radiographs he was able to obtain. But he had identified, beyond reasonable scholarly doubt, what the Antikythera mechanism was. It was a hand-driven mechanical model of the heavens. It had been built in a Greek workshop, almost certainly in the 2nd century before the Common Era. It had been used by someone, a teacher, a navigator, an astronomer, a wealthy collector. By turning a small crank on its side, that person could predict the positions of the sun and the moon, the dates of eclipses, and the cycle of certain religious and athletic festivals. Lower third, a tens, 1871. The radiographs that Price relied on in his 1974 paper had been made, in the main, between 1971 and 1973. The work was led by Charalambos Karakalos, whom Price had recruited 2 decades earlier, and it represented the most ambitious attempt yet to see inside the corroded bronze without damaging it. Karakalos used a gamma-ray source rather than a conventional X-ray tube. He chose, for the principal exposures, a small sealed sample of iridium-192, mounted in a lead shield and positioned at carefully measured distances from the fragments. The radiation was harder than conventional X-rays. The shadows it cast on the film were correspondingly sharper. The exposures were long. A single plate might require 12 or 15 hours of accumulated exposure. The fragments had to be held perfectly still during that time, on a wooden cradle in a shielded room in the basement of the Athens Museum. There was no automation. Karakalos and his assistants, his wife Emily among them, sat in the corridor outside the shielded room and read books while the iridium sample slowly etched its silhouette into the radiographic film. The work continued, in his fashion, for the better part of 3 years. The plates that resulted, when developed, were extraordinary. They showed, for the first time, the internal gear architecture with sufficient clarity that the individual teeth on most wheels could be counted. Karakalos counted them by hand, working with a magnifying glass over the film, in long sessions that left him, his wife later recalled, with persistent headaches and a temporary deterioration in his eyesight. He counted 223 teeth on one of the major wheels. He counted 53 teeth on another, a number whose mathematical significance Price did not at first appreciate. He counted in total the teeth of more than 20 individual wheels distributed across the visible interior of fragment A. The tooth counts mattered because they fixed the gear ratios. The gear ratios in turn fixed the astronomical functions. A wheel of 223 teeth meshed with a smaller wheel of 19. The resulting ratio mapped with notable precision. The Saros is the 18-year, 11-day, 8-hour period that ancient Babylonian astronomers had used to predict the recurrence of lunar and solar eclipses. This was, in Price's reading, the smoking gun. The Antikythera mechanism was not a generic astronomical instrument. It was a purpose-built eclipse predictor, among other things, calibrated to a cycle that the Greeks had inherited from older Mesopotamian observational traditions, and that no Roman engineer would ever attempt to mechanize. The 1971 campaign also revealed, for the first time, traces of the inscriptions on the inner faces of the casing. The Greek lettering, eroded by 2 millennia of seawater, was almost too faint to read directly. But on the radiographs, where the slight differences in bronze thickness produced corresponding differences in shadow, the inscriptions emerged as ghostly outlines. They were astronomical. They described the risings and settings of bright stars. They named months in the Egyptian calendar. They referred, in at least one place, to a cycle that Price was unable to identify in his lifetime. The work in the basement of the Athens Museum continued in this measured and almost monastic way until the end of 1973. Karakalos produced his final set of plates in the autumn of that year. He sent copies to Price at Yale. Price spent the winter compiling his definitive paper and submitted it to the American Philosophical Society in the spring. It was, by any reasonable assessment, the most thorough analysis of the device that had ever been attempted. It would also be, with one important exception, the last for 30 years. After Price's death in 1983, work on the Antikythera mechanism slowed almost to a stop. The technology to see further into the fragments did not yet exist. The plates that Karakalos had made were the best images that could be obtained. They were good. They were not good enough to resolve the back of the device. For 3 decades, the fragments lay in their case in the Athens Museum, more or less as Stice had first arranged them. Visitors came and looked. Catalogue entries were updated. Scholars cited Price's paper without significantly extending it. The mechanism waited. Lower third, Athens, 2005. The breakthrough, when it came, was a matter of equipment. In the autumn of 2005, a custom-built microcomputed tomography scanner was transported by lorry from a manufacturer in Yorkshire, in northern England, to the basement of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The machine weighed 7.5 tons. It was the largest instrument of its kind ever assembled, and it had been designed for one specific purpose. The purpose was to look inside the Antikythera fragments. The project that commissioned the machine was called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, abbreviated AMRP. It was a collaboration between 2 British universities, Cardiff and Manchester, together with the Athens Museum and a small commercial firm called X-Tech Systems. The senior engineer at X-Tech, a quiet man named Roger Hadland, designed and built the scanner specifically for the task. The project was led, on the scholarly side, by an English mathematician and filmmaker named Tony Freeth, and by his colleague Mike Edmonds, an astronomer at Cardiff University. Freeth had become interested in the mechanism in the late 1990s after reading Price's paper. He had spent several years assembling the funding, the partnerships, and the technical permissions required to bring a scanner of that size into the museum. The scanner that arrived in Athens used X-ray energies of up to 450 kilovolts. It produced, for each fragment, a 3-dimensional reconstruction with a resolution of approximately 50 micrometers, about half the width of a human hair. The data sets it generated were enormous. A single fragment, scanned in full, produced over 1 terabyte of raw radiographic data. The fragments were scanned, one by one, over a period of 3 weeks in October of 2005. The museum's conservation department supervised every movement. Each fragment was cradled in a custom-shaped foam mount, transferred carefully from its display case to the scanner, exposed for several hours, and then returned to its case before the next was brought in. The scans, when assembled into 3-dimensional models, revealed, for the first time, the complete internal architecture of every surviving piece of the mechanism. There were not, as Price had thought, 27 gears in total. There were at least 30. There were not, as Price had thought, a single principal display on the front of the device. There were 2 principal displays, one on the front and one on the back, and the back display contained features whose existence Price had not suspected. The back of the device, it now emerged, carried 2 large spiral dials, divided into many small subdivisions, with sliding pointers that advanced along the spiral as the user turned the crank on the side. The upper spiral covered a 19-year astronomical cycle, called the Metonic cycle, which reconciled the lunar month with the solar year. The lower spiral covered the Saros cycle, the 18-year eclipse cycle that Karakalos had first identified in the 1971 radiographs. Beside these dials were 2 smaller subsidiary dials. The first tracked a 76-year astronomical period called the Callipic cycle, a refinement of the Metonic. The second tracked, of all things, the cycle of the four-yearly Pan-Hellenic Athletic Games, the Olympic, the Nemean, the Pythian, and the Isthmian. A small bronze pointer, advancing 1/4 of a turn each year, indicated which of the four games was due to be held in the upcoming summer. The names of the games were inscribed on the rim of the dial in clear, formal Greek lettering. Beside each name, the host city was inscribed in smaller characters. The mechanism was, in other words, not merely an astronomical instrument. It was also, in part, a calendar of public life. The same hand-cranked drivetrain that predicted eclipses also told you, 4 years ahead of time, when and where the next Olympic Games would be held. The AMRP team announced these findings in a paper in the journal Nature in November of 2006. The paper had 13 authors. It ran to 7 pages in the print edition, supported by a much longer supplementary document available online. It included the first published images from the new tomographic scans, the first complete tooth count tables for all surviving wheels, and the first reconstruction of the backface inscriptions. The reception was, by the standards of academic archaeology, extraordinary. The paper was reported in the international press the day after publication. The museum, which had not made any particular effort to publicize the discovery, was inundated with requests for interviews, for access, for documentary filming. A second Nature paper followed in July of 2008, expanding the analysis to include the Olympic dial and a refined model of the lunar gear train. It was this paper, by Freeth, Jones, Steele, Bitsakis and others, that established the Olympic identification beyond reasonable doubt. It also proposed, on the basis of inscription dating, a likely manufacture date in the 2nd century before the Common Era, most probably between 150 and 100 BCE. The lunar gear train deserves its own attention because it is, in a small way, the most remarkable feature of the entire device. The ancient Greeks knew from astronomical observation that the moon does not move at a uniform rate across the sky. It moves slightly faster when it is closer to the Earth, and slightly slower when it is further away. The difference is small, but it is real, and it had been described in mathematical terms by the astronomer Hipparchus of Rhodes in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The Antikythera mechanism modeled this variation mechanically. It did so by means of an arrangement of 2 small gears, one of which was mounted slightly off-center on the face of the other, and which engaged through a sliding pin and slot connection. As the larger wheel turned, the smaller wheel was driven by the pin. The driving rate varied through the rotation, accelerating and decelerating in a pattern that closely matched the observed variation in the moon's motion. It is a beautiful piece of engineering. It compresses into 2 small bronze wheels a piece of astronomical theory that took the Greeks several centuries of careful observation to derive. It does so without any text, without any calculation, without any input from the user beyond the turning of the crank. The user does not have to know the mathematics. The user only has to turn the handle. And then, on the front face of the device, the model of the moon advances through the sky at exactly the rate that the moon itself does. It accelerates and slows in its small mechanical orbit, century after century, until the bronze itself, in the end, gives way to the sea. Lower third. The face of the device. To understand what the Antikythera mechanism actually did, it helps to imagine yourself sitting in front of it. The device, fully assembled, was about the size of a thick shoebox, roughly 34 centimeters tall, 18 wide, and 9 deep. It was housed in a wooden case, of which only fragments survive, with bronze plates set into the front and back faces. A small crank, on the right-hand side, was the only moving input. The crank turned a shaft, the shaft turned a wheel, and the wheel set in motion the entire internal mechanism. The front face carried a single large circular display. two pointers rotated across this front display. The first pointer indicated the position of the sun against the stars, advancing one full rotation per year. The second indicated the position of the moon, advancing one full rotation roughly every 29.5 days, modulated by the variable rate gearing that the AMRP team had reconstructed. On the same display, a small silver and black hemispherical ball, mounted on a sub-mechanism, rotated in time with the moon's position to show its current phase. Full, new, crescent, gibbous, in real mechanical analog. A further set of pointers almost certainly displayed the positions of the 5 planets known to the ancient Greeks: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. The existence of these pointers was proposed by Freeth in 2012 on the basis of a careful rereading of the inscriptions. Each planet, in his reconstruction, was driven by its own internal gear train. The planetary gears themselves do not survive. The fragments are too damaged. But the inscriptions on the front cover describe their movements in unambiguous terms. They refer to a set of small pointers distinct from the lunar and solar pointers. The original users would have read those pointers across the zodiac scale. This part of the reconstruction remains, in the published literature, the most debated. The number of planetary gears, their precise tooth counts, and the exact form of the displays are reconstructed rather than observed. But the existence of some planetary display on the front face of the device is now generally accepted. The back face, as the 2005 scans revealed, was even more elaborate. The upper spiral dial, divided into 235 small cells, displayed the metonic cycle. Each cell corresponded to one lunar month. A small pointer advanced one cell per month, sliding along the spiral, completing the full circuit in 19 years before being reset by hand to the beginning. The cells were inscribed with the names of the months in the Greek lunar calendars of various cities. The particular inscriptions, when finally read in 2008, named the months of the Corinthian calendar. This calendar was used in Corinth, and in a number of Corinthian colonies in the Western Mediterranean. Among them, suggestively, was the city of Syracuse, where Archimedes had lived and died. The lower spiral dial, divided into 223 cells, displayed the Saros cycle. Each cell corresponded to one lunar month within the 18-year eclipse period. Specific cells were inscribed with letters and glyphs. The glyphs indicated that, in that particular month, a lunar or solar eclipse was due to occur. They also gave an indication of the approximate time of day or night and the approximate magnitude. A user, by reading the position of the lower dial pointer, could therefore predict, decades in advance, when and roughly how an eclipse would happen. The subsidiary dial that tracked the Pan-Hellenic games has already been described. Beside it, on the upper portion of the back face, a fourth small dial tracked the Callipic cycle. The Callipic was a 76-year refinement of the Metonic. It was used by Hellenistic astronomers to keep the lunar and solar calendars in alignment over longer timescales. Inscribed on the back cover in dense small Greek lettering was what Freeth and his colleagues have called the parapegma. It was a star-rising calendar. It listed the dates on which various bright stars were first or last visible above the horizon at dawn or at dusk. These risings and settings were, in the agricultural and religious life of the Greek city-states, important markers of the year. The reaping of grain, the celebration of festivals, the opening of the sea to navigation, all were timed by reference to the appearances of particular stars. The parapegma was, in effect, a written calendar of the celestial year, inscribed permanently into the bronze. The mechanical dials, in turn, told you where you were within that year, within the 19-year Metonic cycle, within the 76-year Callipic refinement, and within the 18-year Saros eclipse cycle. A user with a working knowledge of the device could, by turning a single crank, advance the model through any chosen date, past or future. They could read off the configuration of the heavens, the dates of upcoming eclipses, the phase of the moon, and the next Pan-Hellenic games, all at once. It was, in functional terms, a portable model of the cosmos. It was also, in the strictest sense, a computer. It took an input, the turning of a crank, representing time, and produced, through a fixed mathematical relationship encoded in its gear ratios, a set of coordinated outputs. The relationship between input and output was deterministic. The computation was analog. The accuracy, by the standards of any pre-modern astronomical instrument, was extraordinary. The historian Alexander Jones, in his book A Portable Cosmos, published in 2017, has argued for a particular reading. The mechanism, in his view, was probably intended as a teaching instrument or a wealthy patron's display piece. It was not a working tool used by practicing astronomers. It was, rather, a kind of philosophical demonstration of the order of the heavens, made tangible in bronze. The careful inscriptions, the elaborate dials, the inclusion of the Olympic cycle alongside the eclipse cycle, all point toward an object designed to be admired as much as used. That is plausible. It does not, however, diminish the engineering. Even as a demonstration piece, the mechanism required a workshop tradition of some depth. Gears had to be cut to within a fraction of a millimeter. Astronomical theory had to be translated into mechanical ratios, and generations of craftsmen had clearly worked together long enough to produce, refine, and pass down the techniques required. The mechanism is, in this sense, not a single artifact. It is the visible tip of a tradition. The tradition itself is almost entirely lost. And then, for a while, the workshop is silent. Lower third, the silence. The wreck off Antikythera was a Roman merchant ship. It sank, on the best current dating evidence, sometime between 65 and 50 before the Common Era. Its cargo was Greek. Its destination, almost certainly, was Italy. Perhaps Rome itself. Perhaps one of the wealthy coastal towns of the Bay of Naples, where a market for Greek antiquities had been growing for at least a generation. The mechanism, when it was loaded onto that ship, was already an old object. The inscriptions had been dated by the form of their lettering to the 2nd century before the Common Era. They indicate that the device had been made somewhere between 150 and 100 BCE, perhaps a generation before the ship sailed. It had been built in a Greek workshop, used for some period, and then sold or shipped onward into the Roman world. We do not know who built it. We do not know who used it. We do not know whether other mechanisms like it survived, were copied, or were ever produced in any quantity. What we do know is what happened next. In the centuries that followed the wreck, the Roman Empire incorporated, expanded, contracted, and eventually fragmented. The Greek east of the empire, including the islands from which the sponge divers of 1900 would eventually come, persisted as the Byzantine Empire for another 1,000 years. The Latin West fragmented into the kingdoms of medieval Europe. Through that long span, no device of comparable complexity is known to have been built anywhere in the Western Mediterranean or the European mainland. There are references, in late Roman and early Byzantine texts, to mechanical devices that may have included gearing. There is a small Byzantine sundial calendar fragment dated to the 6th century of the Common Era that does contain a few simple gears. There are descriptions, in the Islamic engineering tradition of the 9th through 12th centuries, of geared astrolabes and water clocks. The Arab engineer al-Jazari, writing in the late 12th century, described and built several elaborate automated devices that included gear trains. None of them approaches the Antikythera mechanism in complexity. Most of them, in fact, do not approach it at all. The mechanical clock was the device that finally restored to Europe something resembling the sophistication of the Antikythera gearing. It appears in monastic records in the late 13th and early 14th centuries of the Common Era. The first reliable references to a weight-driven escapement clock date from around 1280. The first surviving European astronomical clock with multiple coordinated dials, built by the Italian astronomer Giovanni de Dondi, was completed in 1364. De Dondi's clock, the so-called astrarium, is sometimes cited as the European descendant of the Antikythera tradition. It is not, in any direct sense, a descendant. De Dondi had not seen the mechanism. He could not have. The fragments lay, at the time, on the seabed off Antikythera, with no one but the fish for company. What de Dondi had was the textual tradition. He had Cicero, he had Vitruvius, he had the Arabic engineering treatises that had transmitted some part of the Greek mechanical tradition through the Islamic world. He had, in effect, the rumor of what the Greeks had built. He did not have the object. The gap between the Antikythera mechanism and de Dondi's astrarium is, in round numbers, 1400 years. In that 1400 years, European culture lost and then slowly recovered the capacity to build geared computers. The recovery was not a matter of forgetting and remembering. It was a matter of forgetting and reinventing. The de Dondi clock is, in mechanical terms, an independent re-derivation of principles that had been understood, applied, and embodied in bronze 15 centuries earlier in a workshop somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean. The question of where, exactly, the mechanism was built remains open. The leading hypothesis, set out by Alexander Jones and others, points to the island of Rhodes. Rhodes was, in the 2nd century before the Common Era, a major center of astronomical learning. Hipparchus, whose theory of variable lunar motion is mechanically embodied in the mechanism's lunar gear train, lived and worked on Rhodes for most of his career. The philosopher Posidonius, whom Cicero specifically mentions as having built a planetarium in the 1st century before the Common Era, also lived on Rhodes. The Corinthian calendar inscribed on the back of the device is consistent with the calendar in use in Corinthian colonies. Among those colonies was the city of Syracuse. Archimedes had worked in Syracuse before his death, in 212 before the Common Era. A second hypothesis, less widely held, places the workshop in Syracuse itself, in the tradition that Cicero attributed to Archimedes. The Archimedean tradition certainly produced planetary models. The chronology is, however, somewhat tight, and most current scholars place the device a generation or two after Archimedes, rather than within his immediate circle. A third hypothesis, advanced more recently, points to Pergamon in western Anatolia. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, Pergamon housed one of the great libraries of the Hellenistic world, and a substantial astronomical school. The truth is that we do not know. The workshop, wherever it stood, has left no other traces. The men who cut the gears, the astronomers who calibrated the ratios, the patrons who commissioned the work, none of them are named in any surviving document. None of them are likely ever to be named. The mechanism is anonymous. It will remain anonymous. The bronze itself is the only witness left. And then, for a while, the workshop is silent. Lower third are then's present day. The fragments are displayed today in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, in a quiet upper room on the building's northern side. The room is dimly lit. The case is climate controlled. A long glass-fronted vitrine holds the 3 principal fragments, A, B, and C, along with the 4 smaller pieces. Beside them stands a modern reconstruction in working bronze of what the device is believed to have looked like in its complete state. Visitors come and look and leave. There is no audio guide. The wall text is restrained. A paragraph in Greek, a paragraph in English, a small printed diagram. The museum, in its presentation, does not editorialize. The mechanism is allowed to be what it is, on its own terms. In its own terms. In its own terms. Several reconstructions have been built since the AMRP papers. Tony Freeth's team built one. The watchmaker Michael Wright built another. Independent engineers and museums around the world have built others. They are interesting in their own right. They show that the mechanism, as reconstructed, works. A modern craftsman with modern tools and the published gear-tooth tables can build a device that turns smoothly. It will predict eclipses to within a day or two of their actual occurrence. It will track the Olympic cycle for as many centuries as you care to wind it forward. That is, in some ways, the most striking finding of the entire research effort. The Antikythera mechanism is not, in functional terms, beyond modern reach. A working replica can be built today by a skilled clockmaker working from the published data. What was extraordinary, and remains extraordinary, is that someone built the original without published data, without printed gear tables, without the cumulative inheritance of 2,000 years of European mechanical tradition. They built it from scratch. Or, more accurately, they built it from a tradition that had begun centuries earlier and that we now glimpse only in fragments. The 2008 Nature paper, which set out the Olympic dial and the refined gear train reconstruction, closed with a sentence that has been quoted often since. The authors wrote that the mechanism represented a unique level of achievement, the precision of its astronomical calculations, and the elegance of its mechanical solutions set it apart from anything else in the surviving material record of the ancient world. That, in the careful prose of a scientific journal, is a strong claim. It is also, on the present evidence, true. The fragments themselves are small. They weigh, together, about 3 kilograms. They are corroded, fragile, and, in places, almost unreadable. They have been studied, on and off, for 126 years. They will continue to be studied. The micro-CT data from 2005 is still being analyzed. New inscriptions are still being analyzed. Refinements to the gear train reconstruction continue to appear in the scholarly literature. It is possible, even likely, that future scans, future readings, and future replicas will reveal further functions that no one has yet identified. The planetary gears, in particular, remain a subject of active reconstruction. The full content of the back cover parapegma is still being decoded. The mechanism, after 26 centuries, has not yet finished telling us what it is. The diver who first surfaced from the wreck, Elias Stadiatis, lived for another 34 years. He died in the 1930s on the island of Simi, of causes that the local records do not specify. He had spent most of his life sponge diving, and most of his lungs, by the time he died, had been damaged by the work. He never visited the Athens Museum to see the cargo that he had found. He never read Stice's paper, or Rediadis's monograph, or Price's eventual reconstruction. So far as we know, he had only the one encounter with the mechanism. A few seconds in the cold green light at the foot of the Mediterranean cliff before he turned and signaled to be brought up to the surface. What he saw in that brief encounter was a Roman cargo ship that had gone down with its load of Greek statues. What he could not have seen in the corroded lump that his crewmate brought up the next day was the deeper finding. The cargo also contained the surviving evidence of a civilization that had, for a while, built machines. A civilization that, in some workshop now lost to us, had taken the careful astronomical observations of generations of patient men. They had translated those observations into the precise integer ratios of small bronze gears, and they had built, by hand, with files and dividers and small chisels, a working model of the heavens. That civilization did not survive. Its workshops were dispersed. Its tradition was lost. Its devices, if there were others, have not been found. What survives is one mechanism, recovered by accident, by a sponge diver who thought he had found a coin. It sits in a quiet room in Athens, behind glass in soft light. And the workshop, this time, is silent for good. Word count. Target, 8200 narration words. How?